The shuttle doors slammed shut with a metallic bang that echoed through the cramped passenger compartment. Tom Rivers felt his stomach lurch as the transport lifted off from the Academy station, carrying him and 3 other cadets toward what their instructors called a simple survival exercise. Through the small window beside his seat, he watched the familiar lights of the training facility disappear into the darkness of space. His teammates sat in uncomfortable silence around him. Nira kept checking and rechecking her equipment pack, her blue Centaurian skin taking on a pale gray tint that Tom had learned meant she was nervous. Cole filled most of one side of the compartment with his massive Andromedan frame, all 4 of his arms crossed in the gesture his species used when they were thinking hard about something. Pip sat bouncing in his seat, his small body vibrating with nervous energy while his antennae twitched in rapid patterns. The shuttle banked sharply to the left, and Tom caught his first glimpse of their destination through the window. Kepler 7 stretched out below them like a vast ocean of red sand, broken only by scattered rocks and the occasional twisted plant. The planet looked dead from orbit, nothing but endless desert under a pale orange sky that seemed to go on forever, Commander. Veltar's voice crackled through the shuttle's communication system, his words carrying the clicking undertones that made Tom think of insects whenever the translator tried to render the alien officer's speech. Attention, cadets. You are approaching your final survival assessment. Each squad will be dropped at separate coordinates with basic emergency supplies. Your mission is straightforward but not simple. Survive for 7 standard days and reach the extraction point 40 kilometers north of your drop zone. Tom glanced at his teammates again. They had trained together for months, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, but this would be their first real test under actual survival conditions. The Academy had prepared them for theoretical scenarios, but theory and reality were very different things when your life depended on making the right choices. The shuttle began its descent toward the surface, and Tom felt the familiar sensation of artificial gravity giving way to the natural pull of the planet below. Through the window, he could see their landing zone approaching fast. It looked even more desolate up close than it had from orbit. Nothing but sand and rocks and a few scattered plants that looked more dead than alive. Remember, Commander Veltar continued over the intercom, this exercise tests your ability to function as an integrated unit under extreme stress. The Galactic Defense Corps needs officers who can adapt to any environment while working effectively with beings from any species. Academic failure here means more than poor grades. In real combat situations, it could mean the difference between life and death for your entire crew. The shuttle touched down hard, sending up clouds of red dust that completely blocked their view of the landscape outside. Tom felt the engines wind down as the pilot prepared to drop them off and leave them to face whatever challenges this alien world might throw at them. When the rear cargo hatch finally opened, a wave of superheated air rushed into the compartment, carrying the smell of baked earth and something else Tom could not quite identify. It reminded him of the desert back home in Arizona, but sharper somehow, more alien and hostile. Commander Veltar appeared at the hatch wearing a full environmental suit that hid his insectoid features behind a reflective faceplate. In his hands, he carried a sealed equipment case that contained everything they would have to work with for the next 7 days. Squad 7, you have your coordinates and your mission parameters. Your emergency kit contains standard rations for 4 beings for 3 days, basic medical supplies, a distress beacon for true emergencies only, and standard survival tools. Surface temperature will reach 52 degrees Celsius during daylight hours and drop to near freezing after sunset. The atmosphere is breathable for all your species, but water sources are extremely limited. He handed the equipment case to Tom and stepped back. Your test begins now. We will monitor your progress from orbit, but intervention will only occur if sensors detect immediate life-threatening situations. Prove that you have what it takes to wear the uniform of the Galactic Defense Corps. Tom took the case and felt its weight in his hands. Everything they needed to survive for a week was supposed to be inside this one container. He looked at his teammates and saw the same mixture of determination and fear in their faces that he felt building in his own chest. The 4 cadets gathered their personal gear and stepped out onto the planet's surface. The heat hit Tom like a physical blow, even though he had grown up in desert country and thought he was prepared for extreme temperatures. This was beyond anything he had experienced before. The red sand under his feet felt like it was radiating heat up through the solace of his boots. Behind them, the shuttle's engines began spooling up for immediate departure. There would be no changing their minds, no calling for help unless someone was actually dying. In less than a minute, they were completely alone in the vast expanse of alien desert, with nothing but the emergency supplies and whatever knowledge they could combine from 4 different species and 4 very different backgrounds. Pip was the first to break the silence that followed the shuttle's departure. His words came out in the rapid bursts that were typical of his species when they were under stress. Okay, so we need shelter right away, and we need to figure out how to ration our water, and we need to cover 40 kilometers in this heat without getting ourselves killed in the process. Cole used 2 of his massive arms to adjust his equipment pack while the other 2 shielded his eyes from the blazing sun overhead. The human is the only one among us whose species evolved in desert environments similar to this one. Logic suggests that Tom should take the lead on developing our survival strategy. Tom looked around at the seemingly lifeless landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, then back at his teammates who were all watching him with expressions that mixed hope with doubt. He had spent summers camping in the Mojave Desert with his grandfather learning traditional survival techniques, but this alien world made Death Valley look like a pleasant vacation spot. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he realized that 3 lives besides his own now depended on his ability to find ways to keep them all alive in one of the most hostile environments any of them had ever faced. The emergency kit spread across a flat boulder revealed everything they had to work with for the next 7 days. Tom counted 12 nutrition bars that looked about as appetizing as cardboard, 4 emergency water pouches containing 1 liter each, a basic medical kit, a multi-tool that seemed sturdy enough, a thermal blanket, and something he had never seen before that Nira identified as a soil composition analyzer. 4 liters of water total, Tom said while doing quick mental calculations. That might last us a day and a half if we are extremely careful, maybe 2 days if we barely drink anything at all. But we need to survive for 7 days minimum, and that does not even count the energy we will need to walk 40 kilometers to reach the extraction point. Pip's antennae started twitching in the rapid pattern that Tom had learned meant the small alien was becoming increasingly nervous about their situation. The mission briefing mentioned that water sources are limited on this planet, not that they are completely non-existent. Maybe we can find some if we look in the right places. Tom studied the landscape around them, paying special attention to what looked like the dried remains of an ancient riverbed that curved toward a cluster of rocky hills about 2 kilometers to the east. That might be our best chance. Even in places where surface water disappeared long ago, there are sometimes underground reserves that we might be able to access if we know where to look. As they made their way toward the hills, Tom noticed that his teammates were already beginning to show signs of serious stress from the extreme heat and dry conditions. Nira's breathing had become much more labored than normal, and her blue skin was taking on an unhealthy grayish color that made Tom worry about how well her species could handle prolonged exposure to desert conditions. Cole was managing better, due to his size and natural endurance, but Tom could see that even the big Andromedan was working hard to maintain his usual steady pace. Pip seemed to be having the most trouble with the heat, his normally quick and energetic movements becoming increasingly sluggish as the temperature continued to climb. We need to find shade immediately and wait for the hottest part of the day to pass, Tom announced when they finally reached the base of the rocky outcroppings. From now on, we travel during the early morning and evening hours when it is cooler, and we rest during the middle of the day and at night when the temperature drops. They found a shallow cave that provided blessed relief from the punishing intensity of the alien sun. As his teammates collapsed gratefully in the shade, Tom remained near the entrance, studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to see it the way his grandfather had taught him to see the desert back home. That was when he noticed something important that he had initially dismissed as dead vegetation scattered throughout the area. Looking more carefully, he realized that what he had taken for withered plants were actually some kind of succulent species, similar to the cacti he knew from Earth but with distinctly alien characteristics. Their thick, waxy stems were a mottled green-gray color, and instead of the familiar spines he expected, they had what appeared to be crystalline formations jutting out from their surfaces. "Interesting," he murmured to himself while pulling out the soil analyzer. If these plants were managing to survive in this incredibly harsh environment, they had to have developed some method of storing water that might be useful to understand. The soil readings confirmed what Tom had begun to suspect. There was trace moisture in the ground, probably from underground water sources or from the occasional rainfall that must occur even in this desert climate. These alien plants had clearly adapted over millions of years to capture and store every single drop of moisture they could possibly find. "Tom, what are you thinking about over there?" Pip called weakly from deeper in the cave where he was trying to conserve energy and moisture. "Survival?" Tom replied, his mind racing through possibilities as he remembered everything his grandfather had taught him about finding resources in seemingly barren landscapes. The old man had always insisted that the desert was never truly empty, that it was actually full of life that had simply learned to adapt to extreme conditions. The key was learning to see the resources that were already present instead of focusing on what was missing. "Nira, can that soil analyzer tell us about the chemical composition of organic matter as well as soil?" he asked the Centaurian scientist. She nodded, though the simple movement seemed to cost her considerable effort. "Yes, it can analyze any organic material." "Why do you ask?" Tom pointed toward the nearest of the cactus-like plants with its strange crystalline formations. "Because I think our water problem might not be as hopeless as it looks right now." As the sun reached its highest point and the surface temperature soared well past 50 degrees Celsius, Tom spent the next several hours carefully studying the alien plants using the analyzer to understand their structure and composition. What he discovered was remarkable. The plants were indeed storing significant amounts of water in their thick stems, with nearly 40% water content by mass. But even more importantly, the crystalline structures were not just protective spines, as he had first assumed. They appeared to be some kind of sophisticated natural filtration system that processed atmospheric moisture and trace minerals from the soil. "It is like they are living water purification systems," he explained to his teammates as the afternoon dragged on and the heat remained almost unbearable. "The question is whether we can safely extract and use that water without poisoning ourselves." Cole raised himself up on his elbows, moving his forearms in the gesture that Tom had learned indicated curiosity among his people. "Your species has experience with extracting water from plant life in desert environments?" Tom grinned as he thought about his grandfather's patient lessons about barrel cacti and other desert survival techniques. "You could definitely say that. But I have never tried it with alien plants before, so this is going to require some careful experimentation." As the sun finally began to set and the temperature started its dramatic drop toward the freezing point, Tom gathered several samples of the crystalline formations from the nearest plants. Working with Nira's guidance, he used the soil analyzer to break down their molecular structure and understand exactly how they functioned. "This is remarkable," Nira breathed, her scientific curiosity managing to override her exhaustion for the first time since they had landed. "These formations appear to be naturally occurring biological filters. They are specifically designed to separate pure water from contaminated sources using multiple layers of filtration." Tom felt a surge of genuine excitement as all the pieces began to fall into place in his mind. "Then we are not just looking at a potential water source. We are looking at a water purification system that has been perfected by millions of years of evolutionary pressure." But as the alien night fell and the temperature plummeted toward freezing, Tom realized that having a theory was only the first step in solving their survival problem. Now he had to figure out how to turn that theory into actual drinkable water. And he had to do it before his teammates' limited water supply ran out completely. Dawn broke over the red desert with the promise of another day of punishing heat. But Tom barely noticed the sunrise because he was focused entirely on what might be their last chance for survival. During the night, their water situation had become truly critical. Despite the strictest possible rationing, they were now down to less than 2 liters total. And the extreme heat was taking a severe toll on everyone except Tom, whose desert-adapted human physiology gave him a significant advantage in these conditions. Nira had barely spoken since the sun came up, conserving every bit of energy and moisture she could manage. Pip's usual rapid-fire chatter had slowed too. Occasional whispered observations as his small body struggled to cope with the dehydration. Even Cole, despite his species' well-known reputation for physical endurance, was moving with obvious effort and showing clear signs of distress. Tom had spent the early morning hours carefully dissecting one of the alien succulents, working with the same methodical precision his grandfather had taught him when processing barrel cacti during their survival training trips in the Mojave Desert. But this was infinitely more complex than anything he had ever attempted before. The water is definitely there in significant quantities, he reported to his teammates, who were huddled in whatever small patches of shade they could find among the rocks. I can extract about half a liter of liquid from a plant this size without too much difficulty. But here is the major problem we are facing. It is not just pure water. The liquid contains dissolved minerals, various organic compounds, and probably alkaloids that could be toxic to some or all of our species. Pip's antennae drooped with disappointment and exhaustion. So our choices are to die slowly of thirst or die quickly of poisoning. Those are really great options to have. But Tom was studying the crystalline formations he had carefully harvested from the plants, turning them over and over in his hands while his mind worked through the possibilities. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before, translucent with an almost glass-like quality, but they were warm to the touch and slightly flexible in ways that suggested they were still living tissue. Nira, I need you to run another detailed analysis on these formations, he said urgently. I want to know exactly how they process water at the molecular level, what contaminants they remove, and how efficient the filtration process is. The Centaurian scientist worked with hands that shook from dehydration, but her expertise and training were still sharp despite their desperate situation. The internal structure is absolutely fascinating, she reported after several minutes of careful analysis. It is essentially a biological version of the reverse osmosis systems we use on spacecraft, but far more sophisticated than anything we have developed artificially. The formations have multiple distinct layers, and each one filters out different types of contaminants and impurities. Tom felt a sudden spark of inspiration as he remembered his engineering courses at the academy, particularly the modules on water purification systems used on long-range exploration vessels. The basic principles were remarkably similar to what these alien plants had evolved naturally over millions of years. What if we do not try to process the plant water directly? He said, suddenly, his excitement growing as the idea took shape. What if we use the plant's own filtration system instead of trying to replace it? Cole shifted his massive frame to look directly at Tom with all 4 eyes focused intently. Explain your thinking. Tom began gathering materials from their immediate surroundings, more of the crystalline formations, some of the flexible inner membrane tissue from the plant stems, and several flat rocks that could serve as collection surfaces. We build a solar still using basic physics principles, but instead of relying only on simple condensation, we incorporate the biological filters that evolution has already perfected. Working as quickly as his dehydrated state would allow, he began constructing what looked like a crude funnel system using the available materials. The crystalline formations were carefully arranged in multiple layers, positioned exactly as they appeared in the living plants. The flexible plant membranes were stretched between rocks to create collection surfaces that would capture and direct the processed water. The basic principle is actually quite simple, Tom explained as he worked, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the early morning hour. We heat contaminated water, including our own recycled wastewater if necessary, and allow it to vaporize into steam. As the water vapor passes upward through these biological filters, they should clean it using the same process they use to purify atmospheric moisture for the plants themselves. It took most of the morning to construct the improvised device, with Tom's teammates watching in a mixture of desperate hope and deep skepticism as he carefully poured some of their precious remaining water, mixed with plant extract he had collected, into the system he had built. "Now we wait and see if this actually works," he said, positioning the entire contraption to catch the maximum amount of solar energy. As the alien sun climbed higher in the orange sky, the temperature soared past 55 degrees Celsius as the morning progressed, but inside Tom's improvised biological filtration system, something remarkable was happening. Water vapor was rising from the heated mixture at the bottom, passing through the carefully arranged layers of crystalline formations, and condensing into clear droplets that collected in a small depression he had carved into one of the flat rocks. By midday, when the heat had become almost unbearable, they had produced their first sample of filtered water. Tom immediately tested it using the soil analyzer, and the readings showed pure water with only trace minerals at levels that should be safe for all their species. "It actually works," Nera whispered, her voice hoarse with dehydration but filled with amazement. "You have created a functional water purification system using alien biology." But Tom held up a warning hand before anyone could drink. "We have to test it very carefully first, taking only small amounts. We cannot afford to make anyone sicker than they already are." Each team member took a tiny sip of the warm, slightly mineral-flavored water. It was not the most pleasant thing any of them had ever tasted, but it was clean and safe, and most importantly, it represented a renewable source of survival. As long as they had access to the alien plants and solar energy, they could produce clean drinking water from almost any contaminated source. "How much water can we produce with this system?" Cole asked, already looking noticeably stronger just from the psychological boost of knowing they had found a solution. Tom did some quick calculations based on the production rate he had observed. "With this single setup, maybe 2 liters per day in full sunlight. If we build multiple units and continue to refine the process, we could probably double or triple that output." Pip's antennae perked up for the first time in many hours. "That would be enough to make it to the extraction point with some margin for safety." "That would be enough to make it anywhere we needed to go," Tom replied, but his mind was already racing ahead to the next challenges they would face. Water was just the first and most immediate threat to their survival. They still had to cross 40 kilometers of hostile desert terrain, while dealing with extreme temperature swings and whatever other surprises this alien world might have in store for them over the next 4 days. 3 biofilter systems hummed quietly in the early morning light as Tom and his teammates prepared for another day of trekking across the hostile landscape of Kepler-7. Their small group had transformed into an efficient survival unit over the past few days, with each member contributing their unique skills to keep the water production systems running smoothly. Tom had refined the design based on Nera's chemical analyses and Pip's clever suggestions for improving collection efficiency, while Cole's natural strength made it possible to transport the equipment across the difficult terrain. They were making excellent progress during the cooler dawn hours, crossing red sand dunes that stretched endlessly toward the northern horizon where their extraction point waited. The temperature was still manageable, and their improved water situation had boosted everyone's morale significantly. Tom was beginning to think they might actually complete this survival test without any major disasters when Cole suddenly stopped walking and pointed toward the horizon with 2 of his 4 powerful arms. "Dust storm approaching from the north," he announced in his characteristically calm voice. Tom squinted in the direction Cole was indicating, and felt his stomach drop as he spotted what looked like a solid wall of churning red dust rising from the desert floor. The storm stretched across the entire northern horizon like a massive tsunami of sand and debris, and it was moving toward them with frightening speed. "How much time do we have before it reaches us?" Pip asked, his rapid speech patterns becoming even more accelerated as anxiety took hold. Tom studied the approaching storm and estimated its speed based on similar weather phenomena he had witnessed during his childhood in Arizona. Maybe 20 minutes at most. We need to find shelter immediately, and it has to be something that can protect us from driving sand and debris. They were currently crossing relatively flat terrain with the nearest rock formations at least a full kilometer away in the wrong direction. The storm would easily overtake them long before they could reach any kind of natural shelter that might offer adequate protection. There, Nira pointed toward a cluster of the alien succulents about 100 meters to their left. Those plants are much larger than the ones we have been harvesting. Maybe we can use them as the foundation for some kind of emergency shelter. As they reached the plant cluster, Tom realized that Nira was absolutely right. These specimens were not just larger than the others they had encountered. They were truly massive, with some of the succulents reaching nearly 3 meters in height and 2 meters across. Their crystalline formations created natural windbreaks that might actually provide meaningful protection from the storm. We need to dig a sheltered depression between these plants and create overhead cover, Tom said, dropping his pack and pulling out the multi-tool. Everyone start excavating immediately. All 4 cadets began digging frantically in the red sand. Cole's forearms made him incredibly efficient at moving large amounts of material, while Pip's small size allowed him to create precise drainage channels that would prevent their shelter from flooding if the storm brought any precipitation. Nira used her scientific training to identify the most structurally sound arrangement of plants that would provide maximum protection from multiple wind directions. Tom worked on creating a framework using broken pieces of the crystalline formations and strips of the tough plant membrane material. He was essentially building a temporary shelter that would blend seamlessly with the natural environment, while providing protection from the driving sand and potentially dangerous debris that the storm would hurl at them. The wall of dust and wind hit their position just as they finished their emergency preparations. The world around them disappeared completely in a deafening roar of wind and stinging sand that reduced visibility to 0. The temperature dropped more than 20 degrees in just a few minutes as the sun was completely blocked out by the massive quantities of airborne debris. Tom huddled with his teammates in their improvised shelter, listening to rocks and other objects impact the reinforced plant barriers they had constructed around their hiding place. How long do storms like this typically last? Pip shouted over the incredible noise, trying to make himself heard above the howling wind. Could be several hours, Tom replied, remembering the worst dust storms he had experienced back home. But our shelter should hold as long as the structural integrity of the plant barriers remains intact. What he did not mention to his teammates was his growing concern about their water production systems. The 3 biofilters they had been carefully transporting were now buried somewhere under the sand and debris that was accumulating around their shelter. If the delicate filtration equipment was damaged by the storm, they would be back to desperately rationing their emergency water supplies within a day. As if she could read his worried thoughts, Nira suddenly pointed to something remarkable that was happening in the plant life around them. The alien succulents were responding to the storm in ways that seemed almost impossible. Their crystalline formations were actually moving, rotating, and repositioning themselves to create more effective barriers against the driving wind. The plants were not just passively enduring the storm. They were actively adapting their structure to take advantage of it. They are specifically designed for this kind of weather, Nira said with wonder in her voice, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the storm. These dust storms must be regular seasonal occurrences on this planet. The plants have evolved to use them as opportunities to collect moisture and nutrients from the atmosphere. Tom watched in fascination as tiny channels in the crystalline formations began directing condensed moisture from the storm clouds toward the plant's extensive root systems. Even in this incredibly hostile environment, life had found ways to not just survive, but actually thrive by turning apparent disasters into opportunities for growth. We should learn from their example, he said as an idea began forming in his mind. Instead of just waiting for the storm to pass, what if we try to adapt the same way the plants are adapting, working by touch in the near total darkness created by the swirling dust? Tom began modifying their emergency shelter. He used flexible plant membranes to create angled collection surfaces, positioned salvaged crystalline formations to direct airflow in useful directions, and carved channels that would capture any moisture the storm might provide. The storm continued to rage for more than 6 hours, battering their shelter with wind and debris while the 4 cadets huddled together in their improvised refuge. But when it finally passed and they emerged blinking into the sudden sunlight, they discovered that Tom's modifications had actually worked. They had collected nearly 3 liters of clean water directly from the storm itself, and more importantly, they had learned a valuable lesson about working with their environment. Instead of simply trying to endure it, the landscape around them had been completely transformed by the storm. Sand dunes had shifted into entirely new configurations. Familiar landmarks had disappeared under tons of debris, and their carefully planned route to the extraction point was now completely meaningless. Navigation is going to be interesting. From here, Cole observed calmly as he scanned the altered terrain with all 4 eyes. Tom pulled out their compass and checked their coordinates against the position of the extraction point. It was still roughly to the north as expected, but the most direct route now led through terrain features that had not existed when they started their journey 3 days earlier. "We adapt to the new conditions," he said simply, unconsciously, echoing the survival strategy they had observed in the alien plants. "We use whatever resources the environment provides and keep moving toward our goal." As they broke camp and began their modified trek across the storm-altered landscape, Tom realized that something fundamental had changed in their group dynamic over the past few days. They were no longer 4 separate individuals from different species trying to survive in an alien environment through sheer determination. They had become something entirely new, a hybrid team that combined the best survival instincts and problem-solving abilities of 4 different evolutionary backgrounds, with hard-won practical knowledge of how to thrive in conditions that should have killed them all. The morning of their 6th day on Kepler 7 brought an unexpected discovery that changed everything Tom thought he understood about the alien ecosystem they had been struggling to survive in. He woke to find Pip crouched over one of their biofilter systems with his antennae twitching in the rapid pattern that indicated intense excitement rather than the anxiety Tom had grown accustomed to seeing. "Tom, you need to look at this immediately," the small alien whispered urgently, trying not to wake their other teammates. "The filtration systems are working much better than they were yesterday, and I think something very strange is happening to the equipment." Tom examined their water production setup and quickly realized that Pip was absolutely correct about the improved performance. The output rate had increased by nearly 30% overnight without any modifications to the basic design. Even more puzzling, the crystalline formations they had been using as biological filters were showing clear signs of actual growth, as if they were still alive and actively developing new capabilities. "Nira, wake up," Tom called to the Centaurian scientist, who was already stirring and preparing to collect her morning soil samples. "We need to run some new analyses on the filtration systems right away." What they discovered over the next hour completely revolutionized their understanding of the alien plants and the ecosystem they represented. The crystalline formations were not simply passive filtration structures as they had originally assumed. They were living, adaptive organisms that formed complex symbiotic relationships with their host plants and apparently with any other biological systems they came into contact with. When exposed to different water sources and varying environmental conditions, they actually evolved their filtration capabilities in real time to become more efficient. "We have been accidentally creating a hybrid biological system," Nira explained, her scientific excitement overriding even their desperate survival situation. "Our biofilters are somehow incorporating human engineering principles with alien biological processes. They are becoming more effective because they are adapting to serve both the original plant functions and our specific water purification needs simultaneously." This remarkable revelation came at exactly the right moment in their journey. They were now less than 10 kilometers from the extraction point where Commander Veltar would pick them up. but their remaining path led directly through what appeared to be the most challenging and dangerous terrain they had yet encountered. The familiar red sand was giving way to a region where massive crystalline formations jutted up from the ground like a forest of glass trees that stretched as far as they could see. "Those look like mineral deposits of some kind," Cole observed, using two arms to shield his eyes from the brilliant reflections created by thousands of crystal surfaces. "Crossing that area is going to be like walking through a giant furnace that magnifies the heat from every possible angle." The crystalline formations created a complex maze of highly reflective surfaces that would amplify the already dangerous heat to potentially lethal levels while making navigation nearly impossible. Even worse, the ground between the formations was covered with loose, shifting material that would make walking extremely treacherous for anyone who was not already weakened by days of survival stress. But Tom was studying the towering crystal structures with the new understanding they had gained about the relationship between biological and mineral systems on this planet. The formations looked remarkably similar to the filtration structures they had been harvesting from the plants, just on a massive geological scale that suggested millions of years of development. "What if this is not an obstacle we need to overcome?" he said slowly as an idea began forming. "What if this is actually an opportunity we should take advantage of?" He led his teammates to the base of one of the larger crystal formations and began running tests using their analytical equipment. The results were even more extraordinary than he had dared to hope. The formations were indeed closely related to the plant filtration systems they had been using, but these were ancient, fossilized versions that had been concentrating and purifying groundwater from deep underground sources for geological ages. "There is an entire underground water distribution system here," Tom realized as the implications became clear. "These crystal formations are like biological pumps that bring clean water up from aquifers that are probably hundreds of meters below the surface." Working together and combining all their different areas of expertise, they were able to locate the specific spots where the underground water was closest to the surface and most accessible, using the techniques they had learned from processing the living plants, along with Nara's chemical analysis capabilities and Cole's raw strength. They successfully tapped into what was essentially an unlimited supply of pure, clean water. "We could establish a permanent settlement here if we wanted to," Pip observed, his rapid speech now relaxed and conversational for the first time since their mission had begun. "This location has everything needed to support a large population indefinitely." But Tom was already thinking far beyond their immediate survival needs. They had stumbled upon something that could have implications reaching far beyond passing a simple academy survival test. This entire region was essentially a natural blueprint for advanced terraforming technology that could potentially transform entire planets. "This discovery is much bigger than just proving we can work together as a team," he said to his teammates as the full scope of their findings became apparent. "This whole ecosystem demonstrates how biological and mineral systems can work together over millions of years to transform hostile environments into sustainable habitats. If we can understand how these processes work and learn to replicate them, we could potentially make any planet suitable for colonization." As they made their final approach to the extraction point on the morning of their 7th day, Tom realized that their small group had been fundamentally transformed by their experience. They were no longer just 4 individual cadets from different species who had managed to survive a difficult test through determination and teamwork. They had become something entirely new, a hybrid unit that combined different evolutionary backgrounds and problem-solving approaches to create solutions that none of them could have achieved working alone. The extraction shuttle landed exactly on schedule, with the familiar bone-jarring impact that kicked up the red dust clouds they had grown accustomed to over the past week. Commander Veltar emerged from the craft along with several other Academy instructors, all of them clearly expecting to find exhausted, barely surviving cadets who had just managed to complete their survival requirements. Instead, they found 4 beings who looked healthier and more confident than when they had been dropped off 7 days earlier. More surprisingly, they discovered an elaborate water production and purification facility constructed entirely from local materials that was producing clean water at a rate that could easily support a much larger group. Cadet Rivers, Commander Veltara's translated voice carried what Tom had learned to recognize as genuine surprise in the clicking undertones. Please explain what we are observing at this location. Tom looked at his teammates and saw the same sense of accomplishment and mutual respect in their faces that he felt building in his own chest. Nero, with her renewed scientific enthusiasm and discoveries that could reshape their understanding of biological systems. Pip, with his quick adaptability and intuitive grasp of how different technologies could work together. Cole, with his steady reliability and strength that had made their most ambitious projects possible. He realized that he could not explain their success without acknowledging what they had accomplished as a unified team. "Sir, we learned something important during this exercise," he said carefully. "Survival is not about imposing our own preconceptions and limitations on an unfamiliar environment. Real survival means understanding how different systems work together naturally and finding ways to contribute to that cooperation rather than fighting against it." Commander Veltar moved closer to examine their water production systems, his insectoid features unreadable behind his environmental suit but his body language, suggesting intense interest in what he was seeing. "You appear to have created a sustainable resource extraction operation using entirely indigenous materials and processes. This goes far beyond the basic survival skills we expected you to demonstrate. The planet taught us what we needed to." "No," Tom replied honestly. "We just had to learn how to listen to what it was telling us and combine our different perspectives to understand the lessons it was offering." As they loaded their gear and the portable versions of their biofilter systems onto the shuttle for the return trip to the Academy, Tom took one final look at the alien desert that had tested them so thoroughly over the past 7 days. It no longer looked hostile or barren to his eyes. Instead, he saw a complex, sophisticated ecosystem that had taught them invaluable lessons about adaptation, cooperation, and the unexpected ways that life could not just survive but actually flourish in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The mission had been designed as a simple test to determine whether 4 beings from different species could work together effectively under survival stress. Instead, they had discovered fundamental principles about how diverse teams could synthesize their knowledge and capabilities to create solutions that were far greater than the sum of their individual contributions. As the shuttle lifted off, and the red landscape of Kepler-7 fell away below them, Tom knew that their real education was just beginning. They had proven they could survive together under extreme conditions, but more importantly, they had learned how to thrive together in ways that would reshape their understanding of what was possible when beings from different worlds worked toward common goals with mutual respect and shared determination. The Academy had sent them into the desert to test their limits and see if they could meet the minimum standards required for graduation. Instead, they had discovered that there were no real limits to what they could accomplish when they learned to see challenges as opportunities for innovation, cooperation, and growth that benefited everyone involved. The human cadet's ability to combine Earth-based survival knowledge with alien biological systems, enhanced by his teammates' diverse expertise and perspectives, had transformed what should have been a desperate struggle for survival into a breakthrough discovery that could revolutionize how the Galactic Defense Corps approached colonization, terraforming, and cross-species cooperation in the most hostile environments the galaxy had to offer.